Sandringham began not as a palace of grandeur, but as a quiet country estate tucked deep within the Norfolk countryside, surrounded by rolling fields, dense thickets, and the kind of open skies that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It was far from London's political pulse, far from the ornate halls of Buckingham Palace, and far from the restrictive environment Queen Victoria had crafted around her family. Its remoteness was precisely the point. When Victoria first laid eyes on the estate, she saw more than a rural retreat. She saw a solution to a problem the monarchy preferred not to discuss openly. Her eldest son, the future Edward VII, had grown into a young man whose temperament clashed sharply with the disciplined, moral image the Victorian court attempted to maintain. Where Victoria valued restraint, he sought excitement. Where she preached duty, he embraced indulgence. He was charismatic, charming, at times impulsive, and far too willing to occupy the gossip columns of the era. His behavior unsettled not only his parents, but also the rigid court culture that tried desperately to shield the monarchy from public scrutiny. The heir's unpredictability required distance, guidance, and, above all, containment. Thus, in 1862, Victoria purchased Sandringham. On the surface, it was a generous gift for a son reaching adulthood. In reality, it was a calculated decision. The estate's 20,000-acre expanse placed him safely outside London's social temptations and beyond the immediate reach of scandal-hungry observers. Sandringham offered room to breathe, yet remained isolated enough to function as a controlled environment where the heir could be shaped into a suitable monarch. The countryside promised healthier air and quieter days, but it also provided something more strategic: privacy. The original house standing on the property was Georgian in design, graceful, orderly, and entirely inadequate for what the royal family envisioned. It lacked the character and protective atmosphere Edward needed, and it certainly lacked the grandeur expected of a future king's residence. Victoria hoped that giving her son a home far from London would temper his restless nature, but Edward interpreted the gesture quite differently. He saw Sandringham not as a quiet, corrective space, but as a blank canvas. If he was meant to spend his formative years here, then the estate would reflect not his mother's discipline, but his own spirited personality. As soon as the keys were placed in his hands, he began reshaping the property with remarkable speed. The Georgian house was demolished, making way for a new residence that would capture the essence of a youthful prince brimming with energy. The new Sandringham emerged in a style that blended confidence with nostalgia, an architectural language echoing the 16th and 17th centuries, but infused with the imagination of the late 19th. It was sturdy, yet expressive, formal, yet undeniably personal. Edward wanted a home that felt both royal and refreshingly unrestrained, a place where he could step into adulthood on his own terms. Around the house, the land itself was transformed. Wooded areas expanded, long pathways were carved through the fields, and carefully managed grounds provided space for riding, walking, and outdoor gatherings. Sandringham was not simply growing, it was becoming a private kingdom sculpted around the needs, desires, and impulses of the heir to the throne. Under Edward's influence, the estate developed a double identity. Outwardly, it appeared to be a serene rural retreat, a place where the royal family could escape the pressures of court life. But beneath that calm exterior lay a far more strategic purpose. It was a discreet buffer between the future monarch and the public eye, a place where reputation could be shielded while character quietly took shape. In this duality, half refuge, half training ground, Sandringham found its role within the royal network. It became a home where official duties softened, where expectations loosened just enough for the heir to relax, yet where the boundaries of royal identity remained firmly in place. And for Edward, this estate would soon become more than a protective enclosure. It would evolve into the perfect stage for a life lived intensely, energetically, and often on the edge of propriety. His influence would reshape the house further still, turning Sandringham into a residence unlike any other in the royal portfolio, a place that mirrored both the privileges and the contradictions of the prince who called it home. Sandringham's transformation under Edward did not happen quietly. Once he took possession of the estate, the calm, orderly Georgian house that had stood there for decades was treated not as a treasured inheritance, but as an obstacle. He wasted no time in removing it entirely, clearing the ground so he could construct something that better suited his restless temperament. What rose in its place was a residence shaped not by Victorian restraint, but by the impulses and unmistakable personality of a young man determined to live life on his own terms. The new Sandringham emerged with a boldness that surprised even those who knew the prince well. Its style, sometimes described as a revival of 16th and 17th century English design, was less about historical accuracy and more about atmosphere. Heavy gables crowned the roofline, decorative brickwork wrapped the walls, and tall windows invited light into rooms, meant for lively gatherings rather than somber reflection. The architecture carried a sense of confidence, youthful, slightly rebellious, and entirely uninterested in blending into tradition. It was a visual declaration that this estate would no longer be an instrument of discipline, but a playground primed for entertainment. Inside, the design grew even more expressive. Edward insisted that the house support a lifestyle filled with activity, laughter, and constant movement. Rooms were arranged with the intention of facilitating gatherings that lasted late into the night. A billiard room was carved out with generous proportions, lit by warm lamps that cast a glow perfect for competitive games. Adjacent rooms connected seamlessly so that music, conversation, and the clinking of glasses could move freely from one corner of the house to another without encountering the stiff formality found in London palaces. Hidden spaces became essential parts of the interior layout. Edward, fond of novelty as much as privacy, had quiet corners and tucked-away rooms integrated behind heavy wooden panels and discreet doors. These spaces allowed intimate gatherings to unfold beyond the reach of household staff and curious eyes. Some rooms were designed small and low-lit for private discussions, while others opened into larger chambers crafted for laughter, card games, and impromptu celebrations. Each had a purpose, and each captured a facet of Edward's character, energetic, social, and endlessly drawn to excitement. The exterior grounds transformed just as dramatically. Edward's passion for country pursuits drove him to shape the surrounding land into an elaborate natural arena. Acres of woodland were strategically planted to create ideal hunting routes, and clearings were carved out for gatherings before long days outdoors. The estate eventually boasted one of the largest game ladders in Europe, allowing for highly organized hunting events that drew friends, diplomats, and favored guests from across the continent. The prince's enthusiasm for the sport was so intense that he even altered the daily rhythm of the entire estate by setting its clocks half an hour ahead of standard time, simply to give himself more daylight for outdoor adventures. With each edition, Sandringham drifted further from the quiet rural retreat Victoria had imagined. The estate had begun as a controlled environment intended to encourage discipline, yet Edward reshaped it into the complete opposite, an expansive venue pulsing with activity and indulgence. The once modest house had become a vibrant social hub, a place where formal royal identity softened and personal desires took center stage. And yet, even as the estate grew louder and brighter, another change quietly took root. Beneath the energy and spectacle, the atmosphere of Sandringham was slowly maturing, waiting for the moment when both the house and the man who transformed it would step into a new phase, one marked not by youthful extravagance, but by the steady weight of responsibility that awaited him. As the years passed, the boundless energy that once defined Sandringham gradually softened, and the estate began to transform alongside the man who had shaped it. Edward's early years at the house had been filled with spirited gatherings, animated conversations, and long nights brimming with laughter and friendly competition. Yet adulthood, especially when lived under the increasing weight of royal expectation, has a way of reshaping not only a person's temperament, but also the spaces they inhabit. Sandringham, which had once echoed with the sounds of carefree youth, now shifted its purpose as Edward matured into a figure of authority and ultimately ascended to the throne. The change did not happen overnight. Instead, it unfolded gradually, room by room, like a subtle architectural mirror reflecting Edward's evolving priorities. The once bustling entertainment rooms, the bowling alley, the lively game spaces, the corners designed for late-night distractions, began to lose their central place in daily life. Some were repurposed entirely, transformed into quieter, more thoughtful areas. One of the most striking examples was the conversion of the bowling alley into a long library, a transformation symbolic of both personal growth and the shifting tone of the household. Shelves replaced polished wood lanes, and books, many collected over decades, took the place of conversation, noise, and exuberance. Where music and chatter had once dominated the evenings, now a more contemplative atmosphere settled across the estate. The interiors grew more muted, filled with objects that carried meaning rather than novelty. Portraits of ancestors, maps, heavy drapes, carefully curated collections of rare items, all contributed to an air of dignity that pushed Sandringham closer to the world of traditional royal estates. The exuberant charm of the early years did not disappear entirely, but it was now balanced by a tone of refinement and responsibility. Even the lighting changed. Brighter, more scattered fixtures gave way to warmer, steadier illumination that suited quiet discussions, reflective evenings, and private family gatherings. These changes signaled more than aesthetic adjustments. They marked Sandringham's slow transition from a playground of youth to a residence that supported the daily life of a ruling family. Edward, now a mature monarch with a firm sense of his role, brought a new rhythm to the estate, one defined by formal dinners, meetings with advisors, weekend gatherings that carried more diplomatic weight than recreational intent, and family traditions that were gradually woven into the fabric of the house. The estate's halls, once venues for spirited games, now hosted moments of family bonding, seasonal celebrations, and visits from relatives both close and distant. In the quiet rooms and long corridors, one could sense the shift from youthful spontaneity to a more measured pace. Even the grounds adjusted to the new atmosphere. While hunting remained an integral part of Edward's lifestyle, the estate's outdoor spaces were increasingly maintained with an eye toward order rather than spectacle. Paths were straightened, gardens were redesigned for leisurely walks rather than lively gatherings, and the estate took on a calmness that would eventually define its character in the early 20th century. Yet beneath this surface of maturity and order, Sandringham harbored vulnerabilities that no amount of stability or refinement could conceal. The estate's beauty and carefully maintained facade could not hide the fact that it was, at its core, a house shaped by evolving needs rather than long-term planning. Its rapid expansions, renovations, and structural modifications, often done to satisfy immediate desires rather than enduring practicality, created hidden weaknesses that would soon reveal themselves. For all its charm and elegance, the estate contained systems that were aging, fragile, and in some cases, dangerously overlooked. As the focus shifted from youthful indulgence to royal routine, the house began to reveal problems quietly brewing behind its polished surfaces, problems that would eventually place the health and safety of its residents at risk. And it was from this point of calm domesticity, with Sandringham now serving as a serene rural home, that a sequence of events would unfold, exposing the hidden dangers lying beneath its picturesque exterior. Sandringham, with its expansive lawns, sweeping views, and refined interiors, projected an image of comfort and calm, an ideal country retreat where the royal family could escape the pressures of the capital. Yet beneath this tranquil surface hid a flaw so perilous that it nearly cost the monarchy far more than damaged reputation. What appeared serene and wholesome concealed a threat embedded not in politics or scandal, but in something far more intimate and essential, the water that flowed through the house. In the early 1870s, as Edward settled into a more disciplined stage of life at Sandringham, he suddenly fell gravely ill. His symptoms puzzled those around him, and soon concern spread far beyond the estate. Physicians suspected an ailment that had haunted the era for decades: typhoid, an infection that thrived in places where sanitation could no longer keep pace with the lifestyle of its occupants. It was an illness that had already struck the royal family in the past, and left emotional scars still felt throughout the household. Now, as news spread across the country, people feared that history was repeating itself. The notion that the heir to the throne might have been exposed within his own home created shock among both the public and the court. Sandringham had been marketed as a place of clean air and pastoral well-being, far from the crowded and polluted conditions of London. Yet the very waters that filled the estate's basins, kitchens, and private washrooms were suspected of being contaminated. Investigators soon focused on one uncomfortable truth: the estate's haphazard growth had outpaced the sanitary systems required to support it. Drainage pipes, wells, and water channels had been installed at different times, without a cohesive plan, leading to dangerous mixing of fresh and waste water beneath the estate's polished surfaces. The royal household launched a thorough inquiry, examining every pipe, channel, and underground passage. Engineers and medical experts descended upon the estate, mapping its water sources and tracing contamination back to sections of the property that had been developed rapidly during Edward's energetic renovations. The findings confirmed what many feared: the water supply was compromised, and the vibrant countryside image hid flaws that made the estate unexpectedly vulnerable. To resolve the danger, the estate commissioned a bold engineering project: the construction of a towering 60-foot water structure built in a striking Byzantine-influenced style. This imposing tower stood on the highest elevation of the property, not as a decorative monument, but as a critical safeguard. At its top rested a massive iron tank, capable of storing tens of thousands of gallons of freshly sourced water drawn from a newly drilled spring. With its elevation and size, the tower provided enough pressure to deliver clean water to every tap and washroom throughout the estate, ensuring safe sanitation and preventing contaminated water from re-entering the system. Hidden beneath its architectural elegance were a series of innovations designed specifically for royal safety. Reinforced pipes carried the water down through the tower's core, distributing it evenly across the property. The interior housed machinery that kept water circulating to prevent stagnation. The structure also served double duty. The tank, if needed, could supply water for firefighting operations, allowing several powerful hoses to operate simultaneously across the estate. Below the tank, a discreet viewing chamber was built, a quiet space where family members could look out across the Norfolk countryside, the calm landscape now guarded by technology instead of relying solely on nature's goodwill. Inside the main house, additional updates followed. Old plumbing was replaced, washrooms were upgraded, and the estate began relying on some of the most advanced sanitary installations of the time. The improvements marked a turning point for Sandringham, transforming it from a picturesque rural estate with concealed weaknesses into a residence far more resilient and future-ready. Yet what happened at Sandringham was not an isolated issue. In truth, the estate was simply the first royal residence where such vulnerabilities visibly collided with the daily life of its occupants. In other palaces, more crowded, more complex, and built centuries earlier, problems were often worse. Behind the ornate facades of London's grandest royal homes, sanitation systems strained under the pressure of thousands of visitors, vast kitchens, and old infrastructure. If Sandringham, with all its space and fresh air, could be threatened by contaminated water, then the risks inside older, denser royal residences were far more alarming. Thus, the story of Sandringham's water crisis served as an unsettling reminder that even the most majestic homes were not immune to hidden dangers. And as we move deeper into the history of Britain's royal palaces, the next chapters reveal that sanitation was only one of the many invisible challenges that shaped, and sometimes jeopardized, the lives lived within these iconic walls. Long before modern engineering brought order to the hidden systems beneath London, the royal palaces lived with a reality far removed from their polished floors and ceremonial grandeur. Behind the gilded mirrors, beneath the chandeliers, and under the feet of thousands of visitors, an invisible battle raged against smells, leaks, and the slow, stubborn advance of an overworked sewage network. And nowhere was this contrast between appearance and reality more striking than in Buckingham Palace, the monarch's official London residence and, for a time, a place so overwhelmed by odor that even its most powerful inhabitants struggled to endure it. By the mid-19th century, London was swelling in population. Its aging sanitation network, built for a smaller, slower city, was collapsing under the weight of rapid growth. Buckingham Palace, plugged into this fragile system, suffered from the consequences with an intensity that shocked aristocrats and visitors alike. Inside the palace kitchens and servant corridors, the air could grow so heavy and pungent that workers whispered about parts of the building being nearly unusable. The problem didn't stop at the lower levels. The odor had a way of drifting upward, navigating staircases and air shafts until it seeped into reception rooms where courtiers attempted to maintain decorum. The source of this overwhelming stench lay not in any one mistake, but in a chain of interconnected issues. Aging pipes, poorly ventilated chambers, and the sheer volume of waste produced by a building designed for a smaller household. Frequent leaks made the situation far worse. The palace floors, especially in service areas, were sometimes slick with water that had flowed where it should not have, water that often carried far more than mere moisture. The staff worked constantly to control the problem, but every temporary fix highlighted the larger truth. The palace needed an overhaul that Victorian engineering had not yet delivered. London itself was experiencing the same struggle. The Thames, once a working river, had become so polluted that its surface darkened, thickened, and produced an odor that rolled across the city like an ever-present warning. The crisis reached its peak during the scorching summer of 1858, a season that would later be known as the Great Stink. The heat intensified every smell rising from the river, turning central London into a citywide chamber of fumes. Parliament draped soaked curtains in their windows, desperate to keep the air at bay. Officials fled meetings, unable to bear the conditions. Even Queen Victoria, accustomed to ceremony and endurance, found herself overwhelmed by the pungent atmosphere. During a boat ride meant to show her the state of the river, she pressed a perfumed handkerchief tightly over her nose, her posture stiff with discomfort. Reports described her leaning away from the railings, determined to remain composed even as the air grew intolerable. After only a brief time on the water, she instructed the vessel to turn back toward the palace, convinced she would faint if forced to remain any longer. Her words to her daughter afterward hinted at genuine alarm. She described the experience as nearly suffocating. Within Buckingham Palace, the situation soon became impossible to ignore. The royal household had always worked diligently to keep the palace pristine, but no amount of polished silver or gleaming marble could distract from the fact that the building's internal plumbing was dangerously outdated. Pipes leaked, drains backed up, sewage seeped into places it should never reach. Servants battled the issue daily, but the problem surpassed their tools and their authority. This crisis, both inside the palace and across London, finally pushed the city toward modernization. Engineers and inventors began designing new systems, stronger pipes, improved ventilation, better water flow. The groundwork for a safer and more hygienic London was laid, and Buckingham Palace would eventually benefit from the wider transformation. But the memory of that era, when elegance clashed so dramatically with environmental reality, remained etched in the history of the royal household. And as the capital struggled with its river and its pipes, other palaces, older, heavier, and more intricate, faced even more daunting challenges. The sanitary troubles at Buckingham Palace were only one chapter of a much larger story, and soon the focus would shift from smells and leaks to vulnerabilities of a different kind, the security flaws hidden within the walls of estates that were supposed to protect the crown itself. The turning point in the royal household's long struggle with sanitation arrived not through sweeping political reform or royal decree, but through the work of a man whose name would one day become synonymous with the modern toilet, Thomas Crapper. His contribution was more than a curiosity of history. It was a revolution, one that reached into the private lives of the royal family, reshaped the hidden infrastructure of their homes, and quietly ushered them into a new era of comfort and safety. By the late 19th century, palaces like Sandringham and Buckingham had grown far beyond their original capacities. Rooms had multiplied, staff had increased, and indoor plumbing, still a relatively young invention, had been added in fragments over the years. The mismatch between old architecture and new technology created a labyrinth of pipes that could easily fail under pressure. This was the silent flaw of royal life: grandeur on the surface, fragility beneath the floorboards. Thomas Crapper approached these challenges with both practicality and imagination. Though he did not invent the flushing toilet, he refined it, standardized it, and brought a level of craftsmanship that set a new standard for sanitary engineering. When the royal household sought solutions to their long-standing problems, Crapper was the natural choice. Sandringham, especially after Edward's health scare, was among the first estates to receive his attention. What followed was an ambitious installation of dozens of advanced toilet units, each featuring sealed mechanisms, polished fittings, and cedar seats that were considered luxuries of their time. But the true brilliance lay not in the seats but in the systems hidden behind them. Crapper improved the internal plumbing by designing more efficient traps, better airflow within pipes, and mechanisms that reduced the likelihood of backflow. These innovations isolated waste safely, preventing odors and contamination from rising back into living spaces. Inside Sandringham, crews worked through ceilings, under floors, and behind walls. Long-forgotten cavities were opened, revealing narrow service passages where new pipes were threaded in precise arrangements. Workers reinforced sagging sections of the old system and added ventilation shafts that carried unwanted odors to the outside rather than letting them linger in corridors. The installation required remarkable discretion. After all, the appearance of the palace was never to be disturbed. Everything had to function flawlessly without drawing attention to itself. This transformation reshaped daily life in the most personal ways. For the royal family, including Edward and Alexandra, the change brought a sense of ease previously impossible within the estate's walls. Where once they avoided certain rooms due to unpleasant odors or temperamental pipes, they now moved freely through a home that functioned as smoothly as it appeared. Guests, too, noticed the improvement, even if they never understood the engineering behind it. And for the household staff, the upgrade reduced constant battles with leaking pipes, unpredictable drains, and demanding repairs. But the influence of this sanitary revolution reached far beyond comfort. With improved plumbing came improved health, a vital concern for a family expected to embody national stability. The new systems reduced the risks of contamination that had once shadowed the estate, providing peace of mind after the frightening illness that had struck Edward years earlier. Sandringham was not just cleaner, it was safer, both above and below the floorboards. As the palace's water systems became more reliable, attention gradually shifted to another invisible aspect of royal life, one that had nothing to do with sanitation, yet carried consequences far more immediate. Beneath the elegance of their homes lay vulnerabilities not of illness, but of intrusion. The very spaces that Crapper's workers had navigated, narrow passages, hidden rooms, maintenance corridors, reminded the royal household that secrecy within a palace could offer protection or pose danger. And soon, the focus of the royal family would move from pipes and plumbing to something even more critical: the defenses that guarded the monarch's most private spaces. The next challenge lurking inside the royal residences was not contamination. It was security, and the cracks in that system would be revealed in the most unexpected ways. Windsor Castle rises above the Thames Valley, not as a gentle country residence or a decorative royal retreat, but as a fortress shaped by centuries of conflict, strategy, and architectural evolution. Long before it became known for ceremonial processions and state banquets, Windsor was designed with one purpose in mind: to defend the monarchy in an era when threats came not from political scandals or media storms, but from armies, rival factions, and shifting allegiances. Its position on elevated ground was chosen with precision, offering sweeping views in every direction, allowing guards to detect approaching danger long before it reached the castle walls. The earliest builders of Windsor treated the landscape as both ally and enemy. They carved into the natural slopes, reinforcing them with layers of stone, creating walls so thick and so high that no enemy force could hope to breach them quickly. Arrow slits were positioned with methodical care, angled to give defenders the widest possible field of fire, while offering intruders almost no chance to shoot back. Narrow corridors, sometimes twisting deliberately, forced enemy combatants into tight spaces where they could be easily overwhelmed. The design was clever, imposing, and ruthlessly effective in an age when survival often depended on how well a building could withstand sustained assault. Inside, the layout functioned like a living maze. Hidden staircases spiraled through towers, small chambers connected through unexpected doorways, and defensive galleries allowed guards to move unseen. Even the windows told a story, small, deep-set, and impossible for an attacker to climb through. The architecture reflected a world where every stone had a strategic purpose. The castle's great central mound, crowned by the round tower, acted as a final stronghold, a place where the royal family could retreat if all other defenses failed. It was, quite literally, a citadel within a citadel. Over the centuries, as warfare evolved and direct attacks on royal residences grew less frequent, Windsor's appearance softened. Decorative facades were added, grand halls expanded, and ceremonial rooms replaced some of the harsher defensive interiors. Yet, beneath the refined surfaces, the original architecture survived. The old passages remained, the thick walls endured, and the castle's bones continued to reflect its martial origins. Even as the monarchy transitioned from battlefield rulers to diplomatic figures, their primary residence held on to its identity as a fortress, a symbol that authority must be safeguarded, not merely displayed. But the truth about fortified architecture is that it reflects the threats of its own time, not those of the future. The strongest stone walls, once capable of resisting armies, could not stop vulnerabilities that emerged from modern life. As firearms replaced swords, as political landscapes changed, and as palace routines became more ceremonial, the nature of threat shifted from external attacks to unnoticed infiltration. The danger no longer approached from distant hills or through the gates. It crept in through the routines of daily life, exploiting the trust and assumptions of those within the walls. The vast network of rooms and corridors that once protected the royal family became, in some situations, a hiding place for weaknesses. The same obscured passageways that allowed guards to move unseen also made it easier for an intruder to slip through unnoticed. The old structure could not adjust on its own. It required modern systems, alarms, surveillance, discrete checkpoints to compensate for the vulnerabilities left in place by history. And while Windsor remained a stronghold in spirit, another royal residence, far less fortified, far more exposed, would soon reveal just how fragile palace security could become. Despite centuries of architectural evolution and the presence of guards, protocols, and alarms, one moment in royal history would prove that even the most imposing walls could not guarantee protection when modern threats arrived silently and unexpectedly. The next chapter begins with an event so startling that it forced the monarchy to rethink what it truly meant to keep a palace safe. Buckingham Palace, with its grand facade and sweeping forecourt, projects an image of untouchable authority, a place where order is absolute and vulnerability unthinkable. Visitors see towering gates, uniformed guards, ceremonial routines so meticulously choreographed that the palace seems impenetrable. Yet behind the gilded railings lies a structure far more complicated than its stately exterior suggests. A palace of this size, expanded and reconfigured over centuries, is a labyrinth of corridors, staircases, interconnected rooms, and hidden service areas. Its layout is both majestic and bewildering, a puzzle even for longtime staff. And it was precisely within this intricate maze that one of the most shocking breaches in royal history unfolded. At the time of the intrusion in 1982, the palace relied on a combination of tradition, human oversight, and an early generation alarm system designed to monitor its countless entry points. But systems, no matter how well intended, are only as effective as the people who manage them. Over time, faulty sensors, minor malfunctions, and a routine flow of alerts had dulled the sensitivity of those assigned to watch them. What should have been warnings became background noise, lights flickering on a panel so often that staff learned to dismiss them as false alarms. The palace grounds at night, though heavily patrolled, still held vulnerable pockets. Perimeter walls, while imposing, were never meant to function like the ramparts of medieval fortresses. Their purpose was symbolic as much as protective, and a determined individual could still find footholds where stone met metal, where vines softened the edges, or where maintenance structures created shadows. It was through such a section that Michael Fagan, an unemployed man with no formal training and no plan more advanced than impulse, climbed the 14-foot wall and slipped onto royal ground. Once inside the perimeter, the palace transformed from a fortress into a maze. With minimal lighting to preserve its nighttime quiet, long corridors stretched in near silence. Heavy carpets absorbed footsteps. Rows of nearly identical doors lined the walls. Fagan found a drainpipe leading to an unlocked window, slipped inside, and suddenly stood within one of the world's most protected homes, utterly unnoticed. The palace's internal layout, designed over generations to accommodate both ceremonial and domestic life, unintentionally aided him. Corridors branched and reconnected like arteries. Service routes intersected with guest areas. Some rooms were used often, others sat quietly for months without a visitor. For roughly 15 minutes, Fagan wandered through hallways meant for staff, gliding past antique furniture, portraits of monarchs, and display tables that held priceless artifacts. In one room, he paused and reportedly sat on a throne-like ceremonial chair, a detail that would later shock the public as much as the break-in itself. He moved deeper into the residence, climbing a staircase that led toward the private apartments. Along the way, he passed by rooms adorned with ornate wallpaper, delicate porcelains, and polished wooden chests. A cleaner greeted him casually in one corridor, assuming he belonged there. The palace's vastness and the anonymity offered by quiet nighttime routines worked in his favor. Eventually, he reached a door that separated the public side of the palace from the most private realm of all, the Queen's own quarters. The door should have been guarded or secured, but a series of routine shifts and a dog-walking footman left the post unattended. Fagin stepped through. Inside the Queen's bedroom, the air was still. Curtains hung heavily around the bed, and a small bedside table held personal items: a lamp, a glass of water, perhaps a book left open the night before. The furnishings, though elegant, reflected comfort rather than ceremony. Soft colors, modest decor, the quiet simplicity of a room lived in daily. As Fagin approached, he opened the curtains, letting early morning light filter into the private space of a monarch unprepared for such a visitor. The Queen awoke to the silhouette of a stranger standing beside her bed. Her immediate reaction was neither panic nor alarm, but remarkable composure. She spoke to Fagin calmly, keeping him engaged while discreetly reaching for a small alarm device. She pressed it, once, twice, yet no one arrived. The system failed at the very moment it was most needed. The standoff continued until a maid, hearing the faint commotion, entered the room, realized the danger, and finally summoned security. Moments later, officers escorted Fagin away, leaving behind a palace shaken to its core. The break-in revealed not a single failure, but a chain of them: unmonitored hallways, malfunctioning sensors, unattended posts, and a security culture dulled by familiarity. What made the event even more unsettling was its simplicity. A man with no tools, no disguise, and no inside knowledge had roamed freely through Buckingham Palace, reached the monarch's bedside, and remained there for nearly an hour before anyone fully understood what was happening. This vulnerability, exposed so starkly, forced immediate reforms, but even as they were implemented, a deeper truth lingered. The most dangerous breach of all was still to come. This time, the intruder would not climb a wall or slip through a window. Instead, he would walk through the gates in broad daylight, dressed as a member of staff, carrying a tray and blending seamlessly into the daily rhythm of palace life. It was the kind of threat no fortress walls could stop, and it would prove that the greatest weaknesses were often not outside the palace, but already inside it. The next breach of Buckingham Palace did not unfold in the shadows, nor did it involve a desperate climb over stone walls or a chance encounter with an unlocked window. Instead, it occurred in broad daylight, orchestrated not by a disoriented wanderer, but by a journalist who slipped effortlessly into the palace through the front door, because he had been hired to work inside it. There was no cloak and dagger disguise, no elaborate forged documents. He simply applied for a job, and through a combination of luck, careless vetting, and a system stretched thin, he was accepted. Ryan Perry entered Buckingham Palace as a footman, one of the countless staff members who ensured the smooth functioning of one of the most demanding households in the world. The palace's hiring process, overwhelmed and reliant on surface-level references, never realized they were granting full access to a reporter whose true intention was to document everything he saw. Overnight, Perry went from an ordinary citizen to someone who lived and worked among the royals, navigating the very rooms and corridors the previous intruder had stumbled through unknowingly. His daily routine began before dawn. He walked through the staff entrance, put on the palace uniform, and stepped into a world few outsiders had ever witnessed so intimately. What he saw behind the scenes was a striking contrast to the public image of polished elegance. The kitchens, though vast and equipped for large-scale catering, had the utilitarian look of a busy restaurant rather than the glittering heart of royal dining. Stainless steel counters, rows of fridges, stacks of baking trays. Everything functioned efficiently, but the atmosphere was more practical than princely. The corridors were long, plain, and sometimes dimly lit, designed for function rather than grandeur. They twisted behind walls and beneath staterooms, forming a hidden network used by staff to navigate the immense building without disturbing ceremonial activities. Narrow staircases connected floors like secret arteries, allowing workers to appear in the right place at the right moment, while remaining invisible to guests and visitors. Parry wandered these corridors freely. He delivered trays of breakfast items, polished silver, arranged place settings, and learned the rhythms of palace life from the inside. His access took him through rooms filled with decades of accumulated furniture, boxes of formal wear, and storage areas lined with neatly labeled shelves that held everything from porcelain sets reserved for state visits to carefully wrapped seasonal decorations. Some of these storage chambers were vast enough to resemble small warehouses, each item cataloged to support the palace's strict sense of order. And then there were the private spaces, the quiet, lived-in areas that belonged not to an institution, but to the individuals who resided there. Parry saw sitting rooms furnished with comfortable sofas and patterned rugs, a world away from the stiff formality of ceremonial halls. He noticed side tables with personal photos arranged in frames, low bookshelves holding well-thumbed volumes, and small writing desks with tidy stacks of correspondence. These were the rooms where members of the royal family relaxed, read, or simply escaped the demands of public life. The contrast between these intimate spaces and the grandeur of the palace's public areas revealed a striking duality: the monarchy as both a symbol and a family. One of the most astonishing moments came when Parry stepped out onto the palace balcony, an iconic spot seen by millions during national celebrations. Standing where kings, queens, and future heirs had waved to crowds, he felt something between awe and disbelief. The balcony itself was unassuming up close, smaller than it appeared on television, its railing sturdy but plainly constructed. Yet its significance was immense. Few people outside the royal family and senior staff had ever stood there. Throughout his brief employment, Parry documented everything he witnessed. He took photographs, not just of ceremonial rooms, but of everyday details: cereal stored in plastic containers, clutter on sideboards, handwritten notes pinned near staff entrances. These images later stunned the public, not because they showed scandal, but because they revealed how remarkably normal some aspects of palace life were. The monarchy's private world, so often associated with luxury, contained elements of ordinary domesticity that no one expected. His account exposed weaknesses, not of character, but of structure. The palace's vetting procedures were almost non-existent. A reference check consisted of a quick phone call to a pub, where a bartender cheerfully vouched for him. Once inside, Parry's uniform became a passport, granting access to rooms most citizens would never believe a journalist could enter. This revelation forced the royal household to reevaluate its hiring practices, security layers, and assumptions about trust within the palace walls. But Parry's infiltration also did something else. It drew attention to a side of the royal residences that had nothing to do with risk or scandal. Hidden behind the ceremonial splendor were collections of breathtaking art, pieces rarely shown to the public, stored in private rooms, and protected with the same care given to the monarchy itself. The next chapter turns away from breaches and vulnerabilities and steps into the artistic heart of the royal estates, where masterpieces by history's greatest hands, including Leonardo da Vinci, have been preserved in quiet rooms far from public view, waiting for centuries to reveal their secrets. Behind the formal corridors, ceremonial halls, and pristine staterooms of the royal palaces lies a parallel world, one that few visitors ever see, and even fewer truly understand. It is a world of dimly lit archives, climate-controlled vaults, and private galleries filled with paintings, manuscripts, tapestries, sculptures, and objects gathered across centuries. These spaces form the silent heart of the royal residences, a network of treasure rooms where history is not only preserved, but lived in, cared for, and guarded with near monastic devotion. The formation of these collections began long before Britain had museums or public exhibitions. Early monarchs understood that art could communicate power more eloquently than any proclamation. Portraits of rulers, murals depicting victories, tapestries woven with mythic scenes, each item served both aesthetic and political purpose. Over generations, these acquisitions grew, often expanding through diplomacy, inheritance, or the personal tastes of a particular monarch. Some rulers collected with passion, others with ambition, and still others almost incidentally absorbing works as part of diplomatic exchanges. What began as an assortment of prized objects eventually blossomed into one of the most extensive royal collections in the world. Inside the palaces, entire rooms were repurposed to house these treasures. Some became libraries lined with rare books bound in worn leather, their pages whispering with every turn. Others transformed into display halls, their walls crowded with portraits of ancestors, rival monarchs, and figures who shaped European history. Small side chambers evolved into intimate galleries meant only for private viewings. And then there were the true archives, sealed rooms where temperature and humidity were maintained with scientific precision, where natural light was carefully controlled, and where only a handful of specialists were permitted to enter. Walking through these hidden spaces required both patience and reverence. The narrow corridors leading to the archives were often plain, a stark contrast to the splendor of the main palace. But what waited inside defied expectations. Rows of metal cabinets housed intricate miniatures painted centuries ago. Drawers slid open to reveal ancient maps marked by the hands of explorers. Shelves held sculptures and ceremonial objects brought from distant parts of the world. Every item had a story, and together they formed a narrative far larger than any single reign or dynasty. Yet among all the rooms, among all the masterpieces stacked, framed, and carefully secured, one collection stood in a class of its own, so valuable, so delicate, and so historically significant that it required its own sanctuary. This was the room reserved for the works of Leonardo da Vinci. Hidden within the private areas of Windsor Castle, the collection began with more than just admiration. It reflected the profound appreciation that later monarchs felt for Renaissance genius, as well as their desire to preserve ideas that reshaped the foundation of art and science. Over time, the Da Vinci drawings, over 600 in number, became one of the most sacred holdings of the royal archives, kept behind reinforced doors and stored in boxes lined with protective materials designed to slow the natural decay of centuries-old paper. Only a privileged few were ever allowed to study these works closely. Even those granted access entered with caution, knowing that a careless touch or a prolonged moment of unfiltered light could compromise the integrity of a page drawn half a millennium earlier. The atmosphere in this room was unlike any other in the palace. It felt almost like stepping into the artist's personal workshop, where the energy of curiosity, invention, and genius still lingered in the air. But more intriguing than the drawings themselves was the secrecy surrounding them. For almost 250 years, the majority of these works remained hidden from the public eye, locked away in Windsor's protective shadows. Only scholars, archivists, and select members of the royal family ever glimpsed them. The wider world had no idea how many details, how many discoveries, how many breakthroughs lay sleeping within those carefully archived sheets. As one turns from the political corridors and security breaches of earlier chapters into this quiet, sacred realm of artistic legacy, the story of the royal palaces shifts once again. What lies within these walls is no longer a tale of danger or vulnerability, but of creativity, intellect, and the extraordinary mind of a man whose sketches, some visible, some invisible, would reveal secrets hidden for centuries. Deep within Windsor Castle, far from the ceremonial chambers and the bustle of public tours, lies a suite of rooms that once held some of the most extraordinary secrets of the royal household. These were not treasure vaults heavy with gold, nor rooms filled with jewels or ancient regalia. Instead, they contained something far more delicate and infinitely more revealing. Hundreds of drawings created by Leonardo da Vinci, kept hidden from the world for nearly 2.5 centuries. These rooms were accessible only to a carefully selected circle, archivists sworn to discretion, scholars invited by special permission, and members of the royal family with a personal interest in the arts. The entrance was unmarked, blending into the castle's interior like just another door among hundreds. Beyond it lay a world that felt suspended in time. The air remained cool and still, preserved to protect fragile sheets of Renaissance paper. Lighting was soft, precise, and meticulously controlled. Every movement inside the room had a sense of ritual, as though the walls themselves understood the significance of what they guarded. The question of why these drawings remained hidden for so long is tied to both caution and reverence. The collection entered the royal archives after the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. At the time, the survival of any artistic inheritance was uncertain. War, upheaval, and political chaos had devastated countless treasures across Europe. To safeguard Da Vinci's work, pages filled with studies of anatomy, engineering, geology, and the human condition meant removing them from public view. They were housed quietly in Windsor, far from light, humidity, and the risk of mishandling. Their concealment ensured their survival. For centuries, the drawings existed like a private laboratory frozen in time. They revealed Leonardo's mind in motion, delicate studies of muscles, experimental mechanical designs, swirling sketches of storms and flowing water, and portraits rendered with astonishing sensitivity. Some pages contained mirror-written notes, his peculiar shorthand, readable only when held to a reflective surface, as though he were encoding his thoughts for a future generation. Others were filled with the fine lines of chalk and metal point, so faint that they appeared nearly blank to the naked eye. It wasn't until advances in modern technology, particularly ultraviolet imaging, that the full depth of the collection truly emerged. Under UV light, faint marks that had faded over centuries suddenly reappeared in luminous detail. Invisible sketches glowed softly, revealing horses, anatomical studies, and even corrections Leonardo made and later erased. Each rediscovered image felt like a whisper from the past, something Leonardo had drawn, believing it might vanish, only for modern science to bring it back into view. Some discoveries were especially astonishing. Sheets once labeled as blank were revealed to contain entire compositions. Test lines, once thought meaningless, turned out to be experiments in motion and perspective. It was as if the castle itself had been holding its breath for hundreds of years, waiting for the right moment to unveil these long-hidden fragments of genius. From these rooms, scholars gained new insights into Leonardo's process. They saw how he layered ideas, testing, revising, discarding, refining. Windsor's collection was less a gallery and more a workshop, a place where curiosity lived on paper. Each rediscovered line and shadow provided evidence of a mind centuries ahead of its time, exploring mysteries of the natural world, with a scientific rigor rare for his era. Yet, while the Da Vinci Room represented the quiet, intellectual side of palace life, one defined by preservation, study, and extraordinary beauty, the royal residences also carried the weight of more turbulent stories. Their walls had witnessed triumph and cultural achievement, yes, but they had also stood through political upheavals, personal tragedies, and moments so intense they reshaped the identity of the monarchy. From this sanctuary of ideas and light, the narrative of the palaces now shifts toward their darker chapters, times when the walls were not guardians of art, but silent witnesses to the most unsettling events in royal history. The royal palaces of Britain, with all their splendor and ceremonial grace, have not only housed monarchs, they have witnessed the collapse of power at its most dramatic. Behind their ornate facades lie stories in which the grandeur of royalty collided with moments of profound upheaval. Among these, none is more striking than the scene that unfolded at Whitehall in the 17th century, when the walls of a magnificent palace became the backdrop for the downfall of a reigning king. Whitehall was once the largest palace in Europe, a sprawling complex of halls, galleries, courtyards, and chambers that reflected the immense authority of the English crown. At its heart stood the banqueting house, an architectural masterpiece adorned with ceiling paintings by Peter Paul Rubens, vibrant panels celebrating the divine nature and majesty of monarchy. These paintings soared above courtiers during ceremonies and festivities, their rich imagery reinforcing the belief that kings ruled by heavenly mandate. Ironically, it was beneath this very ceiling that one of the monarchy's most humbling moments began. The conflict between Charles III and his parliament had plunged the nation into turmoil. Political tensions escalated into open conflict, and eventually Charles found himself stripped of power, detained, and facing a tribunal that challenged the very foundations of royal authority. On the morning of his final walk, he was escorted from St. James's Palace toward Whitehall, crossing a frost-covered landscape under the watchful gaze of soldiers and citizens who had followed every turn of the conflict with anxious attention. The banqueting house looked magnificent in the winter light, yet behind its imposing exterior, an unsettling contrast played out. While Rubens' ceiling portrayed monarchs as figures touched by the divine, Charles now stood beneath those images as a ruler whose authority had been dismantled piece by piece. As he passed under those paintings, he would have seen scenes that once celebrated the strength and continuity of the crown, scenes that now felt achingly distant from his reality. Outside, workers had constructed a platform against the palace wall. Though the structure was simple, its placement carried symbolic weight. It stood at the threshold between grandeur and judgment. When Charles stepped onto it, he faced a crowd filled with tension, fear, and an uneasy sense of witnessing something unprecedented. The winter wind muted his final speech, carrying his words away before most could hear them. Yet the dignity of his posture left an impression. He addressed the moment not with defiance, but with calm resolve, a final gesture from a man who believed deeply in the divine nature of his role. The event that followed transformed Whitehall forever. A palace built to glorify monarchical power became the stage for its most dramatic collapse. Where kings had once entered triumphant processions, the walls now absorbed the sobering reality that royal authority, once thought unshakable, could crumble in full view of the world. Yet, this was not the end of the story. Whitehall's grandeur faded in the years that followed, with much of the palace lost to time and fire, but the banqueting house survived, a lone witness to both royal celebration and political rupture. The monarchy itself endured as well. After years of upheaval, restoration arrived, and with it a renewed commitment to preserving not only the crown, but also the cultural holdings that had survived the storm, including the artistic treasures that later became part of the royal collection. The palaces, Windsor, Whitehall, Hampton Court, Buckingham, proved resilient in their own ways. They absorbed tragedy, adapted to change, and continued to stand as touchstones of continuity even in eras of uncertainty. Their walls had seen both triumph and sorrow, but they remained, ready to evolve with each generation that called them home. As the royal residences moved into more peaceful centuries, their challenges did not disappear, they simply changed form. The threats were no longer civil conflicts or political upheavals, but new vulnerabilities shaped by modern life, events that tested the palaces in unexpected ways and reminded the monarchy that even the strongest walls must be constantly defended. In the long history of Britain's royal residences, challenges had once taken the form of invading armies, political uprisings, and internal conspiracies. But in the early 2020s, an entirely different kind of threat emerged, one that no fortress walls, no battlements, and no guard regiments could repel. The danger came not as a marching force at the gates, but as a silent presence capable of slipping through the most ordinary moments of daily life. For the first time, the palaces faced an enemy that could not be seen, heard, or predicted: a global pandemic. As the world braced itself against the spread of a relentless virus, the royal household was forced to confront a challenge unlike any in its modern history. The monarchy carried not only symbolic value, but also a constitutional role that demanded continuity. Protecting the monarch from exposure meant more than safeguarding a single individual. It meant preserving stability during a moment when the entire nation sought reassurance. And so, the royal residences, long accustomed to ceremonial rhythms, transformed rapidly into strategic fortifications adapted for a new kind of battle. Windsor Castle became the center of this effort. With its thick walls, secluded grounds, and naturally fortified layout, it offered the ideal location for a carefully controlled environment, one that palace staff soon came to call HMS Bubble. The term began as a light-hearted nickname, but it captured the essence of the system perfectly. The castle became a ship at sea, sealed off from the outside world, staffed by a loyal crew willing to anchor themselves within its walls for weeks at a time. 22 staff members, chefs, chambermaids, gardeners, valets, cleaners, and security personnel, volunteered to live inside the castle on a rotating basis. Each shift began with strict isolation, intensive testing, and a meticulous screening process. Once inside, these individuals did not return home, did not see family, and did not leave the castle grounds until their rotation ended. They slept in designated quarters deep within Windsor's interior, used service corridors normally reserved for swift movement during events, and operated mostly out of hidden rooms where the castle's essential work was quietly performed. These behind-the-scenes areas, rarely seen even by guests, became the center of the castle's functioning. Scentless industrial kitchens tucked behind stone archways produced meals according to strict safety protocols. Private hallways, some narrow, some wide enough for carts and equipment, connected workspaces like arteries in a living organism. Makeshift break rooms were created inside unused service chambers, allowing the bubble staff moments of rest during long days spent maintaining order in an environment where everything had to be sanitized repeatedly. Even the castle's old servant staircases, relics of centuries past, became vital channels in the new operational layout. The Queen, then in her 90s, conducted her duties from within Windsor with remarkable steadiness. She adapted to remote audiences, delivered messages from quiet rooms decorated with personal mementos, and maintained a sense of continuity even as the world shifted beneath her. The castle's private rooms, normally buzzing with activity during state events, fell silent. Meetings moved to telephone calls and video links. Every step, every object, every surface was managed according to protocols designed to keep the monarch protected from a danger that could not be fought with traditional defenses. Other royal residences also adapted. At Balmoral and Sandringham, updated routines and restricted access preserved safety. Kew Palace and smaller properties closed entirely. Even within Buckingham Palace, corridors that once echoed with visitors' footsteps fell silent as staff withdrew and the building entered a rare period of dormancy. The palaces became sanctuaries, not from foreign powers or civil unrest, but from the hidden threat of contagion. The transformation was profound. Royal kitchens switched to minimalist rotas. Private corridors that once connected staff areas became strategic routes for essential movement. Storage rooms were reorganized into sanitizing stations. Even ceremonial spaces were subtly altered to reduce risk. The palaces, which had evolved for centuries to accommodate rituals, diplomacy, and tradition, were now adapting for survival in a world paused by uncertainty. Yet through all these adjustments, another story began to resurface, one tied not to modern viruses, but to aging architecture. Some royal residences, with their intricate designs and long histories of modification, carried hidden weaknesses beneath their elegance. And as the pandemic forced the monarchy to reevaluate every inch of its properties, one home in particular returned to the center of debate. A beloved estate that had once been nearly demolished, saved only through the stubborn devotion of those who cherished its past. As the world slowly emerged from isolation, attention shifted back to this house, a place where history, architecture, and the personal lives of royals had collided more dramatically than anywhere else. It was a home that had stood on the brink of disappearance, challenged not by enemies or epidemics, but by the ambitions of modernity itself. And its story, poised between preservation and reinvention, would bring the narrative of Britain's royal residences to its emotional final chapter. By the mid-20th century, Sandringham had already lived several lives. It had been the playground of a restless young heir, the maturing refuge of a monarch, the stage for family gatherings, and the quiet countryside retreat that held both joyous celebrations and private struggles. Yet, despite its storied past and its deep emotional ties to the royal family, the estate nearly disappeared, not to war, not to fire, but to the sweeping ambition of modern redesign. And the person who almost brought about its destruction was Prince Philip. Philip, never shy about confronting outdated traditions, approached Sandringham with the perspective of a man who valued functionality, efficiency, and architectural clarity. To him, the house felt heavy with mismatched additions. Over decades, wings had been extended, rooms repurposed, corridors redirected, and utilities modified. The result was a structure that, while beloved, carried the weight of its haphazard evolution. Philip saw a house patched together across eras, a place charming in memory, but impractical in reality. He envisioned something cleaner, brighter, and far more reflective of the modern world into which the monarchy was stepping. His proposed solution was radical: demolish the existing house and replace it with a new residence built from the ground up. The architect he consulted favored sleek lines, broad windows, and a design that maximized natural light. The proposed structure would have been a bold departure from Sandringham's Victorian exterior, less a country manor and more a streamlined estate ready for the age of modernism. Open floor plans, simplified geometry, and materials chosen for durability and transparency would have redefined what a royal home could be. To Philip, this was not a destruction of history, but a pragmatic evolution, an opportunity to create a residence that matched the needs of a contemporary monarchy. Yet the proposal met resistance, and it came from someone whose presence carried immeasurable emotional authority: the Queen Mother. To her, Sandringham was far more than a house. It was a living archive of the family's joys and sorrows, an unbroken thread connecting generations. It held the memory of her husband, King George VI, who cherished the estate deeply. It held the warmth of countless Christmas gatherings, the laughter of children exploring its grounds, the quiet moments shared during difficult times. To tear it down was to sever those connections, to erase the very walls that witnessed the evolution of the family itself. Queen Elizabeth II found herself between her husband's modern vision and her mother's profound attachment to tradition. Ultimately, it was the emotional weight of history that prevailed. The plans for demolition were set aside, and Sandringham remained intact. The Queen recognized that a royal residence was not just a structure, it was a narrative, a repository of heritage, and a physical expression of continuity. In preserving Sandringham, she preserved the threads of identity woven through its rooms, gardens, and familiar pathways. And so, the house endured. Its Victorian eccentricities, its layered architecture, its idiosyncratic layout, all remained part of the royal story. Sandringham continued to function not only as a residence, but as a symbol of resilience, a place where history was allowed to breathe rather than be erased. Over time, even Philip made peace with the decision, appreciating the estate's sentimental power and the role it played in the monarchy's public and private life. Yet the story of Sandringham does more than resolve a disagreement about architecture. It highlights a deeper truth about royal residences. These homes, Buckingham, Windsor, Balmoral, Sandringham, and the many smaller estates, are not static. They adapt, resist, hide, reveal, and evolve. Behind their walls lie archives of art that the public has barely glimpsed, secret rooms built for security, passages designed for discretion, and memories embedded in places where history unfolded quietly, away from cameras and crowds. And even now, these palaces still hold secrets. There are rooms seldom entered, documents preserved in sealed compartments, and architectural mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Some are remnants of the past, forgotten storage chambers, unfinished tunnels, relics from wartime operations. Others belong to the present, high-tech defensive systems hidden behind traditional facades, restoration projects concealed from public view, and private spaces where modern monarchs navigate the tension between duty and personal life. The royal homes of Britain remain living structures, shaped by centuries yet still evolving. Their stories continue, layer upon layer, written in stone, paper, paint, and memory. And for every secret revealed, countless more wait in the shadowed corners of their halls, quiet, patient, and ready for the moment when history decides it is time for them to be known.